Over the last 4 weeks, we've been dealing with the greatest story ever told. This story is not just a made-up fiction, though it follows a beautiful storyline, has purpose and progression and flow. The question comes down to this: is this a true story? As we dealt with the genealogies last week, it was very clear that God intentionally knew where this storyline was going. It dumps right into the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem during a certain generation into a certain family. The seed of David, the seed of Abraham, the seed of the woman. Today we want to go from the life of Jesus, his resurrection, forward. And again, I want to see some of the proofs of this story. This whole story, the story of the earth's history, centered on Jesus Christ, the hero, rises and falls on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Josh McDowell says this. He was asked one time by a university student why he couldn't find some way to refute Christianity. He answered this: after spending more than 700 hours studying this study and thoroughly investigating its foundation, I came to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is either one of the most wicked, vicious, heartless hoaxes ever foisted on humanity, or it's the most important fact in history. A missionary one day was with a man that was of another religion. As they spoke, they were watching the celebration of the renowned leader of this religion. They were at the tomb. People were celebrating and rejoicing over his bones, over his grave. The missionary said to this man, if they ever find the bones of Jesus Christ, Christianity would collapse overnight. How true that is. But the fact of the matter is, while you and I believe this, the proof, the burden of proof, is on God and as us, his representatives. People don't just rise from the dead. In fact, if there's anything that scientific observational science has proven, it's that people who die stay dead. And so today we want to look at the proofs of the resurrection. If Jesus rose from the dead, he is who he claimed to be. If he didn't, he's the greatest hoax ever put on humanity. We want to take as our theme today a phrase that Jesus Christ gave to the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, where he said this: Paul, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Paul had not come to a point of accepting Jesus Christ by a mere view of Jesus Christ. There had been a progression of things that had begun to work on his heart. Paul, one of the most masterful minds probably that ever lived, came to Jerusalem sometime within the first 2 years following the resurrection. He had been caught up in this anti-Jesus movement of the Sanhedrin, those who had put him on the cross, those whose conscience was pricking them. And he got involved in attacking Christianity. He hated it. He considered it to be a false religion. He did everything he could, I believe, to disprove the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Somebody says, well, if there had just been somebody who was a knowledgeable man who had tried to disprove the resurrection of Jesus Christ, they would have been able to find it. We have that man in the Apostle Paul, and he couldn't find any way to disprove it. In fact, the evidence kept pointing him the other direction. And so today we want to look first of all at the proof of Paul's conversion, the proof that Paul's conversion brings to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Again, you have letter A on your sheet here. It says he came to Jerusalem within 2 years of the resurrection. You say, how do you know that? The timeline for Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is around 30 AD. That's the date that's most often given. By Acts chapter 6 and 7, we have the death of Stephen. Timelines give that around 32 AD. We know at the death of Stephen, Paul stood there and collected the coats. That was probably a position of honor. He was there. He had been there for some time. How soon after the resurrection, we don't know. But he was there very early on while this was still a major point in Jerusalem. And there was a great divide developing in the city of Jerusalem over the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In his youthful arrogance, submitting to the leadership and the vengeance of those over him. His response was to pick up the animosity of the Sanhedrin and do something about it. Much like when 9/11 happened here in our own country, many of our young people joined the military. We were being attacked, and he got on board with this animosity. Notice letter B, some things about his conversion. I would suggest to you here, letter B, he didn't make the decision without evidence. Paul was doing everything he could to disprove the resurrection. He was trying in his mind to figure out what did happen to that body. But the evidence seemed to be building before him, before his conversion. So when Jesus Christ stands before him, reveals himself to him on the road to Damascus, he says, Paul, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Letter C, he didn't make the decision lightly. Paul was zealous. He was a zealot who persecuted and killed Christians. And for him to go from that position to a position of becoming a promoter of Christianity, something had to happen to change him. Letter D, he didn't make the decision without consequence. He was in a Roman-approved religion, Judaism, moved to an unapproved one, Christianity. And so he made a decision that was going to bring some persecution to him. He made a decision that would cause him to be at odds with his own people, the Jews, and he made a decision that would make him be at odds with the Roman Empire. He did not make this decision without consequence. Letter E, he didn't make the decision for personal gain. He certainly didn't get rich off the decision. He didn't find greater comfort. He was prospering in his religion and went from there to being at odds with his own friends. He ended up in prison, in danger, beatings, whippings, and so many other things that Paul mentions for us in 2 Corinthians. Finally, letter F, he didn't make the decision quickly. He left no stone unturned before Christ gave him the vision. God prepared him as a tool to help us come to the conclusion that the body of Jesus Christ had in fact been resurrected from the dead, and there was no way to disprove that. Paul is a proof of the resurrection. I would suggest to you tonight if you're going to reject Jesus Christ's resurrection, you've got to explain Paul's conversion. I don't think you can do that. We move then into the proof, some other proofs. Paul uses these in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, great chapter on the resurrection. He uses these, and I believe were some things that caused him to come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. You have your sheet there in front of you. I want you to notice Roman numeral number 2, the proof of the Old Testament Scriptures. The proof of the Old Testament Scriptures. Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 15, the first several verses, this, verse 3, For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. Then it goes on that he was seen of Cephas, and then of the 12, and then of 500 brethren, then of James, and then finally of Paul himself. The first of these proofs that Paul gives is the fact that the proof of the Old Testament Scriptures. I'm going to refer to this as the proof of foreknowledge or the proof of intentionality. Let me explain what I mean by this. Imagine for a minute there's a crime that's been committed. As they're looking around and trying to figure out who did this, they go into the home and take the computer of somebody that is being convicted as a possible person who did this crime. They take his computer and they begin to look through and they find files that tell exactly how he's going to commit a certain murder. What he would wear, the procedure he would go through, when he would leave, when he would get to the place he was going to do it, the exact place it was going to be done, the exact gun, putting the gloves on, doing all these things. And lo and behold, you begin to look at the characteristics of the murder that took place, and you find that everything that he said he was going to do is exactly what happened. They take the cameras from the place where the murder happened. He had on exactly what he said he was going to be wearing. He was standing exactly where he said he was going to do it. The person he shot was exactly where he anticipated he would be. In fact, as you read through this, you begin to note details that you had not previously seen on that videotape. You look at that and you go, this is proof this guy did it. There was proof of foreknowledge of what was going to happen. There was proof that this guy had intentionality. He knew exactly what he was going to do, and it got done just that way. When we look at the Old Testament, we realize that the Old Testament was foretelling the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In fact, we have some examples of this. When Jesus had risen from the dead, they were still trying to figure out, people getting rumors that Jesus Christ was risen, the tomb was empty. Jesus meets two men on the road to Emmaus. The Bible says that they didn't recognize him, and he began to share with them that these things had to be, that he had to die, be buried, and risen from the dead. He used nothing to show them and prove that to them apart from the fact of going to the Old Testament Scriptures. He could have done like he did with Thomas and say, look, here's the scars in my hands. Here, note this, here's the hole in my side. But he didn't. He went to the Old Testament Scriptures, and the Bible says that by the time they got to the home and invited him to stay with them, their hearts burned within them because they had been fully convinced that Jesus had died and risen from the grave simply by looking at the proofs of the Old Testament, the intentionality of it. Paul went himself into the synagogues after he was converted and became a preacher to convince the Jews. What did he use? He used the Old Testament Scriptures because that's what they were looking for the Messiah from. They were looking for a king who would bring them peace and these things, but he had to prove to them that Jesus Christ had to die and rise from the dead. We have some samples of Old Testament proofs, prophecies that are in conflict concerning the Messiah's two works, his death, burial, and resurrection, and his coming as a king. We have the picture of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac and yet bringing him back down. We have these three feasts of Israel that are in the spring, the Passover, unleavened bread, and the Feast of First Fruits, that all happened at the very time he was dying. He was in the grave, his body did not decay, and he rose from the dead, Christ the first fruits, then we rise at the harvest. These were all picturing the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. There is the proof of Old Testament Scriptures. He died, he was buried, he rose the third day according to the Scriptures. I want you to notice next the proof of Peter. Peter himself is a proof. 1 Corinthians 15 says this in verse 5, he was seen of Peter. I want to call this the proof of bold declaration. This in of itself doesn't stand alone as a proof. A person can make a claim and it not be true. But until there is a claim, a statement, a fact, there's nothing to test. If the disciples had gone home after seeing the resurrection and said, well, nobody will ever believe this one, so they go home and rebuild their lives and never tell anybody about Jesus Christ's resurrection, there would have been nothing to prove. Also understand this, that Peter, the night of his crucifixion, night of Christ's crucifixion, denied Jesus 3 times in the face of persecution. This man is not a lunatic trying to die, trying to get under persecution, but he saw something that changed his life. In fact, when he stood before the Sanhedrin, he and John, after raising a man from being lame, a man that everybody knew had been lame for years, they're brought before the Sanhedrin and questioned. Says this in Acts 4:13. When they saw the boldness of Peter and John, they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. That statement, I don't believe, is stating that they had been with him for 3.5 years and his life had changed theirs. He had influenced them. I don't question that's a true statement, and I don't question that makes good preaching. However, that's not what this passage, I believe, is saying. They are saying here, when they say this, when we talk to them, they talk with such conviction about the resurrection. They talk as if they've talked to him, seen him, stood with him, listened to him. They took note of it. They made note of it, that somebody says, you know, it's almost as if they were there and they're just telling what they saw. They made note of the fact that they had been with Jesus. You have the proof of Peter, this one who opens the door of the gospel to the Jews and becomes the main speaker on the day of Pentecost. He declares the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Next, I want you to notice Roman numeral 4, the proof of the 12 apostles. The proof of the 12 apostles. 1 Corinthians 5 says this, that he was seen of the 12. This I want to refer to as the proof of multiple witnesses. The Bible teaches this, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let a word be established. If I'm the only one who saw something and a man is standing in court and I give testimony against him and there's no other witness, no other circumstantial evidence, my witness ought not stand biblically. You have to have at least 2, and if you question those 2, you can demand a third one. We don't believe something just because somebody told us something. In the case of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you have 12 witnesses. You have these 12 apostles who went and preached the gospel. Contrast this, for example, to the visions of Joseph Smith, or to the vision that Muhammad supposedly had. Perhaps they did, perhaps they didn't. But there's nobody to give corroborating evidence of the fact that they did or what they saw. How many witnesses gave proof of Christ's resurrection? Paul says here 12, including Matthias. Letter C, they all died and or suffered for their testimony. The word martyr comes from martyrius in the Greek, a word that doesn't mean somebody who tells something, it means somebody who suffers as a martyr. All but John, crucified, stoned, or speared, suffered greatly in one way or another. Contrast it to a man who's in prison and says, hey, I want to tell you something about so-and-so. I'll stand as a witness if you'll give me some time off of my stay here in prison. You would question that kind of witness. These men had nothing to gain if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. They died and suffered for their testimony. Letter D, their witness could also be corroborated with the evidence. Things they observed and testified about were public events, not done out in the wilderness someplace. Imagine for a minute these men, Jesus Christ had taken these men out in the wilderness. He was out there, he died, he left, whatever, and he tells these men, go back to Jerusalem and tell them that I died on the cross and rose again. You would question that. This happened on one of the busiest days in Jerusalem, very notable event by a very notable person, and these things are transpiring in public places. There's corroborating evidence. There is an empty tomb. There was a cross that many saw him on. And there's no way to explain what happened to that body when the Sanhedrin themselves had set the guards up to make sure it didn't happen. Then not only do you have their spoken witness, but you have the written witness preserved for us today. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, we have 4 written records called the Gospels. Notice next, if you will, letter E, Roman numeral 4, letter E, the written witness preserved for today. God has given to us 4 written records called the Gospels. We need 2 or 3 witnesses for a word to be established. God has given us written witness. He's given us 4 of them. 3 of these involve first-hand witnesses. You have Matthew, one of the apostles. The book of Mark, the apostle behind that is Peter. And then you have John. Then number 3, you have 3 knowledgeable outside corroborators. Mark was close to the apostles. His mother was Mary. And it's very conceivable that even the Last Supper was in their home. Though he was not old enough to be one of the disciples, he was close to them and could corroborate much of what they said. You have Paul, who himself became one of the apostles and learned much from them in his early days. And then you have Luke, a man who probably went and did research while Paul was in prison in Caesarea, speaking to first-hand witnesses of things that had happened. But you say they all had something at stake. They were followers of Jesus. They had invested 3 years of their life in his life and ministry. Maybe they figured out a way to steal the body and then said they had seen him resurrected from the dead. That leads us to number 5, the proof of the 500. There were 500 people who saw Jesus Christ risen from the dead. In the city of Jerusalem, 500 people who had seen something like this would have made a tremendous impact. We're going to refer to this as, the bullet there, the proof of numbers. If 2 or 3 witnesses is sufficient, we have 12 in the apostles. We'll count that as 1 even, because in case they corroborated together. But then we have this witness of 500 witnesses, sheer numbers of people that saw him. Letter A, in Jerusalem, this would have made an impact. Letter B, Paul, at the time he wrote this, that he was seen of over 500 witnesses, was getting ready to take a group of Corinthian believers, representatives of the church, to Jerusalem to deliver an offering there to the elders of the church to give to the poor in Jerusalem. These men very likely could have or would have talked to some of these 500 people to get evidence. I want to move on to number 6, Roman numeral 6. I want you to note here next, Paul says this, he was seen of James. He was seen of James. Number 6 is the proof of James, and the bullet point there is the proof of competing interests. The proof of competing interests. What do we mean by this? If the Sanhedrin had been on the other side supporting Jesus and they had found Jesus dead, James might well have been one of the first they looked at. And follow along with me on this story. Imagine Prince William of the British Crown and his family, his wife and children were killed. Do you think it might be possible that Prince Harry and his wife might be questioned if they had any role in this? Would there be looking by those involved in trying to figure out who killed these people to see if there's any tie between Harry and some of the people involved in it? I think there would be. Whether or not he was ever involved, he would be questioned. He has a competing interest. If his brother, Prince William, is gone, he becomes king. So who was James? Is he just number 501? Is he just one more to see him? No, he's not. Matthew chapter 13, verse 55 lists for us the siblings of Jesus. It gives us another list in the book of Luke, I believe it is. And in both of these, James is listed first. The likelihood of this is the first one listed there is the firstborn son. So if Jesus Christ is gone, if he died, James would be the next in the genealogical line of the Messiah. Very likely that Joseph had talked to him and said, if anything ever happens to Jesus, you make sure you keep the genealogical line of the Messiah. James was aware of his position. And when Paul looked at James and saw that James refers to him now not as a competing interest, but as a servant of Jesus Christ, one of the leaders, one of the heads in the Jerusalem church as the church is being found, I believe it pricked Paul's heart. Why would he do this? He's a religious Jew. He would be next in the genealogical line of the Messiah. I believe there was a prick in Paul's heart, a goad that he couldn't answer. Before Christ's death, and we find that James didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. But then he saw the resurrected Lord. Is he the only representative of the family that saw him? Were there others in the family that saw him? We don't know. But the fact of the matter is, Paul makes a point of the fact that James did see him, and I believe that's a very significant statement if we understand who James was. He believed in him, became the head of the church at Jerusalem, letter D here, and called himself the bondservant of Jesus Christ. Notice next, if you will, then, Roman numeral 7, the proof of corroborating evidence. Paul came to Jerusalem, as we said earlier, within 2 years, and probably considerably sooner. He was already in a position of respect at Stephen's execution. And we're going to refer to some events that we mention here in the book of Acts as proofs of circumstantial evidence. Whether Paul himself was actually here for all of these or had heard about some of them through others that were, these things undoubtedly worked in Paul's mind. Paul was the apostolic support behind Luke's writing. These things that happen in Luke are events that Paul observed or saw or heard or knew of in giving the events of the church. Acts isn't just a history of the church. It's a history of Paul's ministry, and I believe very possibly of his conversion as well. Letter A, we have here in Acts chapter 2, the events of Pentecost. Whether he saw this himself or heard about it from some of his circle of friends in and around the Sanhedrin, we don't know. But the events that he heard about this day all revolved around the preaching of Peter. What did Peter preach on that day? Christ not only died and was buried, but he rose again. And my friend, you can't create a mighty rushing wind. You might produce some sort of speaking in tongues that nobody understood, but you can't create languages that people understand in multiple nationalities. You can't create an earthquake. You can't create flames coming from your head. And as Paul hears this and notes that these men are saying this to prove the resurrection of Jesus Christ, God is at work here this day, much like he was on Mount Sinai when Moses received the law from God. Letter B, you have Acts chapters 3 through 5. You have a lame man, raised to walk. You have in Acts chapter 5, verse 15, many sick are healed. So much so that people would bring their sick loved ones, hoping that just the shadow of Peter might cross them as he walks by. In every one of these situations, Paul even sees these men before the Sanhedrin giving witness that these are happening as witness of Jesus' resurrection. He can't explain that. It's corroborating evidence from God himself. Letter C, Acts chapter 5, verse 18, we see that the 12 were imprisoned. The 12 were imprisoned, and as they were waiting for trial the next day, an angel comes at nighttime and releases them. And as the Sanhedrin goes the next morning to get them from the imprisonment and bring them for trial, they can't find them, and angels let them go. And he's told them to go stand and preach at the temple. How'd that happen? How'd these men get out of that prison? The guards don't know. And as these men are standing there, giving witness, giving testimony to the Sanhedrin is turning against these 12 and could very easily have been the end of the church age right there. The apostles were about to be put to death. And a man that Paul loves, respects, has learned from, a man by the name of Gamaliel, he's there as his intern, his student. Gamaliel stands and says, "Gentlemen, let's be careful. We might be fighting against the very work of God." And I believe this made an impression on Paul. Number one, the release of these 12 from prison, how that happened. And then number two, to even realize that this wise old man that he revered is perhaps even questioning the resurrection himself. Could it have happened? We move on to letter D then, Acts chapter 6 to 7. We have the preaching and the stoning of Stephen. Paul was there that day. He heard the preaching of Stephen. This report of what Stephen preached probably came from Paul himself. He heard these things. And as the heart of these men was pricked and they turned to throw stones on him and stone him to death, he himself observed the power of Stephen's preaching. He himself saw Stephen raise his hand and said, wait, Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And it made an impression on Paul. Letter E, Acts chapter 8. We have the spread of the gospel despite the Sanhedrin's, and we might add Paul's best effort to stop it. As he sees this happening, they persecute in Jerusalem, and it goes out to Samaria. It goes on down to Ethiopia. He undoubtedly remembers Gamaliel's words as he's there before the Sanhedrin and says this, But if all this be of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest haply ye be found even to fight against God. And I believe we have in Acts chapters 1 through 8 here some things that Paul is kicking against, that goad of his conscience that's causing him to question his position against the resurrection. Finally, as he's been prepared for this, Jesus Christ reveals himself to Paul, and he says, Lord, what would you have me to do? He's without excuse now. And as he sees the Lord Jesus Christ personally, the last one there, he sees him as one born out of due season. He puts his faith in Jesus Christ and becomes a mighty spokesman for the gospel, not only to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. The story of the Bible rises and falls on the resurrection. If he is risen from the dead, the story's true, created by God. One day Jesus Christ will come and every one of us will give an account before him. If he's not, then let's say together, like the rich fool who built barns, eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow we die. Paul himself says that. If there is no resurrection, forget this whole thing. Let's go eat, drink, be merry, because it's all over. It's useless. We die. We turn back to dust. But if he is risen, there's an eternity to be lived for, a decision to be made about Jesus Christ. He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and one day every one of us will give an account of himself to him, and will be rewarded based on our deeds, whether they be good or whether they be evil. Have you put your faith in Jesus tonight? If so, is it affecting your life day by day?